everybody, good morning. Welcome to session 12 of our verse-by-verse study through the book of Colossians. My name is Pastor Derrick. Welcome to our virtual life Bible study here at City on a Hill. Glad that you're joining with us today. And if you're new here, welcome. Glad that you have joined us. Even in session 12, you'll still get a lot out of this. And as we move forward, we're actually just a week away from finishing this study. And then we're going to be diving into the next study, which I'll talk about at the end of this video. This week we're in chapter 4, verses 2 through 6, so a shorter passage this week, but still jam-packed with a lot to talk about. I opened the study guide talking about an experience I had a couple years ago that was such an incredible, it was actually 3 years ago now. I think it was in 2017. I was asked to officiate a wedding for a young couple here at the church that had the gal had been here for some time, was plugged into the community here, met this guy, started dating him, got engaged, and they asked me to officiate the ceremony. Really sweet couple, really, really wonderful. In fact, I still talk with them from time to time. They moved into the Dallas area, so they're not as close anymore, but still talk with them from time to time, and just a great couple. The groom was from Brazil, and they did their wedding ceremony in her mother's backyard. It was a beautiful, beautiful home right on, I think, Lake Louisville, if I'm not mistaken. Wonderful little setup outside. He's a Star Wars fan. In fact, he got me a Darth Vader mask to wear when I came out, and they had the Imperial March. It was really it was one of the funnest weddings I've ever been a part of. But for the ceremony afterwards, the reception, we had dinner. And rather than catering it from a company, the groom's family and friends, also all Brazilians, offered to do a Brazilian barbecue. Now, if you're a fan of meats at all grilled, then you know Brazilians grill better than anyone. Just an incredible spread of food. And the meat there was so flavorful. It was so good. I mean, I could not get over how much flavor they brought out of. It wasn't like any specific spices or seasons. It was just like this really rich flavor. And so I went over to where they were cooking and I asked them, what are y'all putting on this? This is amazing. And he said, honestly, we use just one ingredient, salt. That's it. And he said, you put a lot of salt on there, and just when you think you have too much salt on the meat, you put even more salt on it. And I was really just blown away by that. And of course, I went home the next day and grilled myself because I love to grill. I grill multiple times throughout the week. And I used his advice. I put some on there and I thought, okay, this is probably too much. And then I added a bit more and then I grilled it, and it was the best meat that I had ever grilled. And I unlocked the key to the Brazilian flavor of Brazilian barbecue. Salt matters. It's the most important thing in the kitchen. I get criticized sometimes. Shout out to Brittany Bauer, dear friend of mine, and also editor of the study guides that you are reading along with this, hopefully. And she always used to criticize me because I wouldn't put enough salt on the food. And it's always because I like to give people that freedom to put the salt on the food themselves. Some people like a little more, some people like a little less. But when I'm grilling now, the salt goes on whether you like it or not. This week I thought about that because in Colossians 4, verse 6, Paul says, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt." And he uses this kind of imagery to show that the way we speak, specifically to outsiders, to non-believers, should be flavored with grace, the message of grace. And he likens that to food flavored with salt. Salt is used in a variety of ways in the New Testament. Of course, in the New Testament time, they didn't have refrigerators, so preserving food was done differently than it is now. Now we just put it in the refrigerator, cover it. It stays fresh for a couple days, few days. If you want it to stay fresh longer, you put it in the freezer, right? They didn't have that back then. They had salt as a preservative. So when Jesus talks about this in Matthew's Gospel, he talks about being, this is Matthew 5, salt of the world. He's likely talking about salt as a preservative there. He's talking about the moral decay of society and how we are to be salt, that we preserve our morality as Christ followers, as image bearers of God, but more than that, followers of Jesus, that we preserve this sort of godly morality. Here in this passage, I think he really is talking about just flavor, because he says your speech should be seasoned with salt. It has this sort of flavor aspect to it. Really, the whole theme of this week's passage is about evangelism, is about outreach, how we relate to non-Christians. There's certainly way more to be said about evangelism than what this passage tackles. But what this passage does say is vitally important to how we understand our relationship with the outside world. There are two major underlying themes as we relate to non-Christians that Paul talks about. The first one is prayer. And I'm not going to go through this all the way through. I hope you'll use the study guide. It is linked in the description below. But essentially, your prayer should be consistent. He says that you are to be steadfastly in prayer, to continue steadfastly in prayer. That's in verse 2. And the word here, proskartereo, it's a word that means to persist in adherence to something, to pray without ceasing, in other words, to kind of echo 1 Thessalonians 5:17. So our prayer should be consistent. It should be cautious. In other words, it should be watchful. It should be aware of potential threat. So when you pray, you are praying with evangelism in mind, with and we're going to talk about why that is in a minute. It's the third part. You should be praying for the outsider, for the opportunity to witness to the outsider, but being aware that as you are witnessing to non-believers, as you are sharing the gospel, you are essentially doing what Jesus talked about in Matthew 16:18, where the gates of hell will not prevail against you. In other words, witnessing, evangelism, is an act of spiritual war, because you are attacking the dominion of darkness, the dominion of Satan. All who are outside of Christ belong in the dominion of darkness. They are under their father, the devil. And so when we go into the act of evangelism, essentially what we're doing is we're leaving the kingdom of light. We are pushing into the dominion of darkness, and we are grabbing them. Now, this is not, of course, by our power. This is the act of God, and ultimately is what brings someone into faith. But when we engage in evangelism, we are entering into the enemy's territory, and we are stealing them away from the enemy's territory and back into the kingdom. That's why it says in Colossians, that we talked about several weeks ago now, that for those who are in Christ, you've been transferred from the domain of darkness into the kingdom of His beloved Son. Right? So this is an act of war. So it should be consistent. Your prayer should be consistent. It should be cautious. And finally, it should be considerate. Paul says in verses 3 and 4, at the same time, pray also for us, check this out, that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison. Remember, Paul is writing this letter from prison. He's been imprisoned for doing exactly what he's asking the Colossian believers to do, which is go make disciples. Share your faith and pray that God would also open doors for you to bring people into the kingdom of light. And pray also for Paul that God would open doors for them, that even from prison he would be able to bring several into God's kingdom. So the first aspect of evangelism that Paul is dealing with here in these first few verses is prayer, the importance of prayer. So important. Be consistent, be cautious, and be considerate. But secondly, he talks about wisdom. In verse 5, he says, walk in wisdom, peripateo, it's the Greek word that means to walk. Walk in wisdom towards outsiders. And we have kind of two ways that wisdom is played out in this verse. Number one is we're to have the right priorities before non-believers. Wisdom orients our priorities. It orients us towards the right priorities. There are times when I want to do what I want to do, and I act selfishly. That's acting without wisdom. That means that I have the wrong priorities. I'm doing things that benefit myself, but maybe not the kingdom. But to walk in wisdom then means to reorient my priorities such that the things that I want are put last, and the things that value the kingdom of God are put first. So that's the first thing. He says making use, or the best use of our time, making best use of the time. And this is a really interesting Greek word that Paul uses here. It's the Greek word exagorazo, and it is a word that we have translated making the best use of. It's actually a word that means to buy back or to redeem, the word redemption. If you're obviously familiar with that word, it's a key word in the New Testament. This is the same exact word, exagorazo. So in Galatians 4 and 5, it says, "But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem, or that he might buy back those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons." So here's what this means. It means that to buy back time, making the best use of time, or to buy back or to redeem time, means that in the same way that we were bought out of bondage of sin and freed from it, we are to purchase time out of the bondage of sin and redeem time that would have been used for ungodly things, now to be used for godly things. It's a really cool image that Paul presents here in his wording. So we use wisdom, by having the right priorities, by redeeming the time that we have as Christ followers, but two, by using the right words. Verse 6 says, and this is the one that we started with, "Let your speech always be gracious, filled with grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." In other words, this is not about curse words, this is not about cuss words, this is not about any of those things. It's about having speech that is honoring to the kingdom, that is that sets up Christ and exalts gospel truths over everything else. So if we share gospel truths, but we do so in the midst of defaming or dishonoring or flagrant speech about other things, then we're not walking in wisdom. So I see this a lot, and I'll just be honest with you for a moment. I see it a lot on social media, right? Where Christians are outspoken Christians online. They post Bible verses. They post where they've checked into church, where they've done this and that, and then on the next post is some political or social commentary on something that is incredibly dishonoring or incredibly defaming to somebody that they disagree with. So I'll shoot straight with you for a minute. Terminology like calling people snowflakes or libtards or whatever the other side of it, if you're on the other side, because it's not just a conservative problem, it's a people problem. We all struggle with this sin nature, right? And when we get in disagreements on social media, particularly about social issues or political issues, it seems like Christians just throw the rules out the window. And it's very difficult to walk with wisdom when you do that. It's very difficult to make a case for grace when you're also tearing the very people down who likely need to hear the gospel. So I want you to consider that this week, that when you post something online, consider what it is that you're promoting and what message are you sending. And if you are taking shots at a group of people, a camp of people who are in stark disagreement with you, bear in mind that those people are likely the people who need Jesus the most. And they're not going to hear you if you are making fun of them. Your speech is not seasoned with salt. It is not gracious. And I realize that's difficult, and I have to check myself as well. Every time I post something, I have to ask the question, does this dishonor any group of people? Does this hurt any group of people? Does this prevent people from hearing what I have to say? And then I weigh out whether or not I should share it or not. And you would be surprised at the amount of things that I begin to share and delete before I ever post them, because I realize, I don't know that this is really worth what it's going to cause. So keep that in mind this week. Hope you'll enjoy this study. Praying for you this week. We've got one more week next week to cover. And then let me say this, lastly, we are going to be going back to Genesis. There was a whole debate in the beginning when we started Colossians as to what we would do when we began meeting again, if we had finished Colossians or not. Well, we are not meeting yet, and we'll be done next week with Colossians, and so we're going to just jump back into Genesis. I'm tired of waiting. I want to get back to it. I didn't want to do it because only about a third of the Genesis study will have videos with it, but maybe I'll go back and film videos for the first sessions that we've already covered. Either way, we're going back. So look forward to that. We are tentatively looking to begin meeting on September 13th. We're going to begin live streaming tentatively on that morning on Sundays, and what we're going to do is allow for people to register to come to church at a very limited capacity. You will have to wear a mask, so if you're not with that, then continue to worship at home. That is the requirements we're going to put on right now. But we are getting to that point where I think we need to give people the opportunity within safe boundaries to worship together. That is not official yet, so don't quote me on that. We still have to meet as an elder body to determine that, but that's the tentative date that we're looking at, September 13th. So I hope you will continue one way or the other doing what you feel like is most conscionable before God and for the health of yourself and your family. And hopefully you understand that we love you and are doing everything we do with you in mind, regardless. So hope you have a great week. Miss seeing you. Ask questions. If you have questions, message me, call me. Study guide is linked in the description below. We'll see you next time. Bye.